The summer air in Florida carried the scent of salt water and jasmine as the small coastal town gathered for what everyone thought was a celebration of love destined to last forever. The pastor, respected, admired, a man whose sermons filled pews each Sunday, was finally taking a wife. For years, his congregation had watched him pour his life into the church, guiding others with his words of faith and discipline. Now, at last, he had found someone to share his life with. His bride seemed almost heaven-sent, elegant, graceful, a woman who seemed to radiate calm strength. Friends whispered that the match was perfect, that God himself must have written their story. The wedding that evening was something out of picture book. White roses lined the church aisles, their petals glowing under soft candlelight. The bride glided down the aisle in lace, her veil trailing behind like a cloud, as the organ swelled and the congregation rose to their feet. Cameras flashed, children clapped, and families leaned close to catch every detail of a union that felt bigger than two people. To outsiders, it was flawless. A pastor who had given his life to God and a woman who seemed devoted to the same path. Together, they looked like the embodiment of faith, trust, and promise. At the reception, laughter filled the hall. Guests raised glasses of champagne, while the newlyweds moved gracefully across the floor in their first dance. Someone joked that the pastor had never looked so human, blushing, smiling, holding his bride with a tenderness that caught many off guard. Speeches followed, voices trembling with joy as friends blessed the marriage and prayed for their future. Outside, the Florida night sky glittered with stars, a perfect backdrop for what seemed like a perfect beginning. But perfection is fragile. Behind the applause and the music, whispers of nerves and exhaustion were easy to dismiss. After all, weddings were emotional. No one noticed how the pastor's smile stiffened at moments, or how his hand tightened just a bit too firmly when guiding his wife toward their exit. Guests cheered as the couple slipped into their car, bound for the honeymoon suite where petals had been scattered on crisp white sheets and a bottle of champagne waited to be opened. For the community, the night ended with joy. They went home convinced they had witnessed a union blessed and unshakable. But in that room, as the candles burned low and the music from the reception faded into silence, the story shifted. What should have been a night of intimacy, trust, and new beginnings instead became the stage for a revelation so shocking it would fracture not just a marriage, but an entire community's sense of faith and safety. By morning, the news would spread like wildfire. The pastor who had preached about love and forgiveness was found crouched in a bloodstained suite. The bride who had been lifted up as an image of beauty and devotion was gone forever. Police lights cut across the hotel walls. Reporters rushed to the scene, and the congregation that had celebrated hours before found themselves staring into the abyss of scandal and horror. No one could understand how quickly joy had turned to tragedy, how a night filled with laughter, music, and prayers for a blessed future had ended in violence. The answer lay in a secret revealed at the worst possible moment, a truth the pastor claimed left him shattered and betrayed. What he did next would ensure his name would never again be spoken from a pulpit with reverence, but whispered in courtrooms and newsrooms as a cautionary tale of faith twisted by rage. This is the story of a wedding night that ended not with vows fulfilled, but with a deadly betrayal. A story that asks whether shock and anger can ever excuse the taking of a life, or whether beneath the lace and roses, it was always a tragedy waiting to happen. He grew up in the kind of home where the Bible sat on every table and the words of his father carried more weight than the evening news. In a modest Florida town, the boy who would one day stand at the pulpit was shaped by discipline, tradition, and an unshakable belief that appearances mattered just as much as faith. His father had been a stern man, a former military officer turned deacon who demanded respect in every breath. His mother, a quiet figure who rarely raised her voice, modeled obedience and prayer. Together, they carved into their son the conviction that God's favor was reserved for those who lived without blemish. From a young age, he was taught that his path was not his own. When other boys played baseball or chased trouble down by the docks. He was reciting verses, setting up chairs for church meetings, or walking door to door with his father to hand out pamphlets. Teachers praised him for his seriousness, calling him an old soul in a young body. By the time he was a teenager, he was already leading youth groups, delivering small sermons that hinted at the commanding presence he would later carry into adulthood. In college, while many of his peers explored freedom, he doubled down on discipline. He majored in theology, minored in communications, and quickly became the kind of student professors cited as future leadership material. He didn't date much. In fact, his friends joked that he married the church before he ever thought about a wife. To him, romance was secondary, something he'd pursue when the timing was right, when God provided the partner who matched his purpose. When he took his place behind the pulpit in his late 20s, the congregation quickly rallied around him. He had the rare gift of charisma wrapped in restraint. His sermons weren't loud, but they carried conviction. He spoke of truth, integrity, and purity with such intensity that listeners found themselves both inspired and challenged. He called out hypocrisy without flinching, warned against the dangers of deception, and often reminded his flock that truth is the foundation of trust, and without it, even love will rot. Behind the scenes, though, the pastor's life was starkly solitary. Parishioners would invite him to Sunday dinners, but he often declined, preferring long evenings of study. His home was tidy to the point of austerity. No clutter, no unnecessary decorations, just bookshelves lined with religious texts and a few framed photographs of family. He lived as though the entire world might step through his door at any moment to inspect him. And in a way, they already did. As a pastor in a town where everyone knew everyone, his life was under constant scrutiny. With every year that passed, the questions grew louder. When would he marry? People whispered about how strange it was that such a strong, respected man remained alone. Some speculated he was simply too devoted to the church. Others wondered if there was a darker reason, though few would say it aloud. For him, the whispers were a constant reminder that perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. Marriage, in many ways, became the missing piece that would silence critics and complete the picture of his upright life. When she appeared, beautiful, poised, and seemingly cut from the same cloth of faith, it felt like prophecy fulfilled. She attended services quietly at first, but her presence drew attention. She sang the hymns with conviction, volunteered for church events, and carried herself with a dignity that impressed the older women in the congregation. The pastor noticed, though he was careful not to show it. Slowly, conversations began, small talks after service, brief exchanges at community gatherings. Soon, the connection grew undeniable. To his congregation, it looked like the answer to prayers. At last, their pastor had found someone worthy of his hand. The courtship was brief, perhaps too brief, but no one dared to question it. After all, who would doubt the judgment of a man so devoted to truth and integrity? If he saw in her the qualities of a godly wife, then surely she was just that. And so, the engagement was announced, and the town celebrated as though it were their own victory. The pastor himself believed he had been blessed. Finally, the missing piece of his carefully constructed life had fallen into place. He would no longer stand alone at weddings or baptisms. He would have a partner at his side as proof of God's favor, as evidence of his wholeness. What he couldn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that the very thing he had built his reputation upon, truth, was about to be shattered in the most intimate and devastating way. She arrived in Florida like a breeze no one had expected. Quiet at first, then unforgettable. To the congregation, she seemed almost too perfect, graceful in the way she carried herself, soft-spoken yet confident, always dressed in modest elegance. She claimed she had moved south for a fresh start, leaving behind the bustle of a larger city where, she hinted, life had been less forgiving. The details of her past were vague, wrapped in half-answers and polite deflections, but no one pressed too hard. In a small town hungry for beauty and newness, she was embraced without question. At Sunday service, she would slip into a pew near the middle aisle, her head bowed during hymns, her voice clear when she sang. She volunteered to help with children's programs, joined charity drives, and offered smiles that seemed to light up even the most hardened church ladies. People noticed how she complimented others with sincerity, how she carried herself with grace under the steamy Florida sun. Soon, whispers spread. Who is she? Where did she come from? But those questions were quickly overshadowed by admiration. In the eyes of many, she was a blessing, an answered prayer for a pastor who had waited too long for love. She told stories about working in healthcare, about caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. She explained that her parents had both passed years earlier, leaving her to navigate adulthood alone. There were no siblings mentioned, no extended family to speak of. When pressed about where she grew up, her answers were gentle but non-committal, steering conversation back to the present. To most, that mystery only added to her allure. She seemed like a woman forged by hardship but softened by faith, a survivor with a heart for service. Privately, she was careful, always mindful of details. She kept paperwork neatly filed, her identification in order, her history tied up in documents that appeared flawless. She understood the importance of blending in, of never giving anyone a reason to dig too deeply. In conversations, she focused on others, listening, laughing, asking questions. Rarely did she allow anyone to linger too long on her own past. For the pastor, this discretion felt like humility, even modesty, and he admired it. He believed he had found someone who valued character over show. Their courtship unfolded quickly. He was drawn to her gentleness, the way she seemed to truly understand the burdens of his calling. She listened intently when he spoke about the pressures of leadership, about the loneliness of carrying the expectations of an entire congregation. She offered encouragement, reminding him that even shepherds needed rest, that even men of God deserved happiness. Her presence soothed him, eased the sharp edges of his rigid life. To outsiders, the pairing was almost cinematic. The disciplined pastor and the mysterious but devoted woman, two lives intersecting at just the right time. Congregants smiled knowingly, whispering that God had finally rewarded their pastor with a companion he deserved. No one saw a reason to question the speed of their engagement, nor the gaps in her history. They were blinded by the romance, by the idea that every man of faith should one day receive his bride. And she played the part flawlessly. At bridal showers, she blushed at compliments, thanking the women who fussed over her dress and decorations. At church gatherings, she leaned against her fiancé with a quiet pride that made the community's hearts swell. To the town, she was everything a pastor's wife should be: supportive, devout, radiant. Yet beneath the polished surface, there was a truth she held close, a truth she feared might ruin everything if revealed. She had spent years building this new life, piecing together an identity that aligned with who she truly was. To her, marriage was not just a union of faith and love. It was the culmination of a battle she had fought in silence for most of her life. She believed she deserved happiness, that she had finally found someone who would accept her without question. But in protecting herself from rejection, she had made a choice: to conceal the one detail that could shatter it all. As the wedding day approached, her nerves grew sharper. There were moments when she looked at him, saw his unwavering devotion to truth, and wondered if silence was a sin. But she pushed those doubts aside, convincing herself that love would cover all secrets. That once the vows were spoken, once they were bound before God and community, nothing else would matter. On the day she walked down the aisle, no one saw the flicker of fear behind her smile. The veil hid the trembling of her lips, the way her breath caught as she reached the altar. She had made her choice, to carry her truth quietly, praying it would never surface. What she could not imagine was that the revelation would come sooner than she ever feared, on a night meant for celebration, in the intimacy of a honeymoon suite, where secrets are hardest to keep. The reception had wound down with laughter and clinking glasses, the last guests waving goodnight as the newlyweds slipped into the waiting car. Inside the honeymoon suite, the hotel staff had gone all out, rose petals scattered across crisp white linens, champagne chilling in a silver bucket, candles flickering in glass votives. To anyone looking in, it was a scene of perfect romance. But behind a closed door, a storm was quietly gathering. The pastor poured the champagne with a shaky hand, his nerves betraying him, though he masked it with a smile. He had preached dozens of weddings, prayed over countless couples, but now it was his turn to step into the role he'd long delayed. He kissed her forehead gently, whispered words of gratitude, and tried to steady the weight pressing against his chest. She laughed softly, telling him to relax, reminding him this was their night, just theirs. They spoke briefly about the ceremony, about the joy on the congregation's faces, about the way the children twirled to the music at the reception. For a fleeting moment, the pastor allowed himself to believe this was everything he'd prayed for, the missing piece to his carefully constructed life. He looked at her, radiant in the candlelight, and thought, finally, I am whole. But when the champagne glasses were set aside and the veil was gently removed, reality cracked. As intimacy drew closer, he discovered what no sermon, no prayer, no vow could have prepared him for. In that instant, the image of his perfect wife shattered. The woman he believed to be a symbol of purity and truth revealed a body that did not match the story he had been told. His breath caught, his chest tightened, the room spun. She tried to speak, her voice trembling, an apology hovering on her lips. She began to explain the battle she had fought, the truth she had hidden out of fear of rejection, the belief that love would be enough to bridge the gap. But her words were cut short by his face, frozen, pale, eyes wide with disbelief. The pastor staggered back, shaking his head as though the very air had betrayed him. To him, it wasn't just a secret. It was a violation of everything he stood for. His entire life had been built on truth, on the conviction that deception was poison to the soul. And now, in the most sacred moment of his life, he felt deceived in the deepest way possible. Rage mixed with humiliation, and humiliation curdled into something darker. His thoughts raced. What will the congregation think? What will the community say? How could she stand before God and hide this from me? Her tears came quickly, streaming down her cheeks as she reached for him. Please, she whispered, I love you. I didn't want to lose you. I thought if we made it here, if we said our vows, you'd understand. She tried to touch his hand, to calm him, but he pulled away, pacing the room like a man trapped in a cage. The pastor's voice broke, rising in fury, then falling into guttural whispers. You lied in God's house. You lied to me, to all of them. You made me a fool. His words grew harsher with each breath, accusations spilling from him like venom. She begged him to listen, to see her as the same person he had fallen in love with. But he no longer saw his wife, only betrayal wrapped in lace. The air thickened. His anger grew uncontrollable, an eruption of years of pressure, expectation, and fear. The champagne bottle shattered against the floor, a sharp crack that echoed off the hotel walls. Neighbors later said they heard muffled shouts, something breaking, then silence. In that silence, something irreversible happened. In a surge of rage and confusion, he lashed out. The violence was sudden, brutal, born of desperation and disbelief. By the time the room stilled again, the bed was stained crimson, the roses trampled underfoot. She lay motionless, her eyes still wet with tears, her lips parted as if trying to finish the words she never got to speak. The pastor stood over her, chest heaving, the reality of what he had done sinking in like a stone dragged to the bottom of the sea. His hands trembled, covered in blood. The candles flickered as though mocking him, their soft glow casting shadows that made the scene even more grotesque. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, mumbling prayers that came out broken and hollow. Lord, forgive me. Lord, forgive me. Hours later, when hotel staff knocked and no answer came, suspicion rose. Police arrived to find the suite in chaos. Broken glass, overturned furniture, petals soaked in blood. The pastor was crouched near the bed, his once pristine wedding shirt ruined, his face pale as chalk. He offered no resistance, only words that would haunt investigators for months. She lied to me. She lied to God. What was I supposed to do? By dawn, the fairy tale had dissolved into a nightmare. The news broke quickly. A pastor arrested on his wedding night for the murder of his bride. What had been hailed as a union blessed by heaven was now whispered about as a tragedy forged in deception, rage, and faith twisted beyond recognition. And for the small Florida town that had celebrated just hours before, the question lingered in every heart. Was this simply the story of one man's breaking point, or had the seeds of disaster been planted long before the first rose was laid on that church aisle? The honeymoon suite was supposed to be a sanctuary, but by the time officers arrived, it looked more like a battlefield. The smell of champagne lingered faintly in the air, but it was overpowered by the metallic tang of blood. The rose petals scattered across the bed were no longer soft symbols of romance. They were stained dark, clinging wetly to sheets that told a story of violence. One heel from a bride's shoes lay discarded near the bathroom door. A shattered wine glass glittered beneath the lamp, sharp fragments reflecting the flickering light like cruel reminders of what had happened. The bride lay across the bed, her body twisted in unnatural stillness. Her lace gown, once the pride of every guest who had admired it hours before, was torn, clinging to her frame in tatters. A deep crimson spread across the fabric, soaking into the mattress below. Her eyes were still half open, glistening as if frozen in the middle of a plea, the tears streaking down. Her face drying against skin now pale and motionless. Investigators would later remark how the scene felt suspended in time, like a photograph no one should ever have to see. The pastor was crouched near the edge of the bed when the first officer entered. His hands were pressed against his head, blood staining his fingers, his wedding band smeared and glinting under the dim light. He didn't move when the officer shouted commands, didn't even flinch when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, broken. She lied to me, to God. The words carried no anger now, only a hollow emptiness that chilled the room more than the air conditioning ever could. Neighbors later testified they had heard muffled shouts around midnight, an argument rising and falling, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. One guest staying a floor below swore she heard a woman's voice crying out, though she admitted she couldn't make out the words. By the time hotel security responded to complaints of noise, the room was already silent. The officers would later note that the silence was what made the scene so unbearable. It was as though the room itself had absorbed the violence, leaving only a stillness that pressed against their chests. Detectives and crime scene technicians moved carefully, photographing every detail. The overturned chair near the desk, the bottle of champagne cracked against the carpet, the bloody handprint smeared along the headboard. Forensic specialists collected fibers from the bed, samples of blood spatter from the wall, and the broken stem of the wine glass that lay embedded with traces of skin. Each piece of evidence stitched together a timeline of panic, rage, and a final act that could not be undone. The pastor was escorted through the lobby just before sunrise, his wrists bound in chains, his face pale and streaked with sweat. Guests who had gathered afterward spread gasped as they recognized him. Hours earlier, he had stood in the same building as a husband celebrating his first night of marriage. Now, he was paraded past them as a murderer. Someone snapped a photo with a cell phone. Within minutes, it was already spreading online. Pastor arrested for killing his bride on wedding night. The body was removed quietly, zipped into a black bag that erased every trace of the woman who had walked down the aisle with such radiant grace just hours before. The sight left even seasoned officers shaken. For some, the image of her veil, still tangled in her hair, would remain long after the case files were closed. Outside, the Florida sky was beginning to brighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in soft pink and gold. The town would soon wake to headlines that didn't belong to fairy tales, but to nightmares. Inside the suite, investigators worked silently, aware that they weren't just documenting a crime scene. They were recording the destruction of an illusion, the collapse of a perfect facade. The murder scene told a story no sermon could redeem. Love twisted into fury, faith collapsing into violence, and a truth revealed too late to save either of them. Detectives from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office were called in before sunrise, their unmarked sedans pulling up to the hotel entrance as television cameras began to gather. The story was too sensational to stay quiet. A pastor, freshly married, accused of murdering his bride hours after their vows. By the time lead investigator Detective Carla Hughes arrived, reporters were already speculating outside, voices sharp against the humid Florida morning. Inside the suite, however, the atmosphere was thick with a silence that only crime scenes know. Hughes was methodical. A veteran of 15 years, she'd seen plenty of homicides, but even she paused at the sight. The contrast struck her hardest. The blood-soaked sheets against a bed of rose petals, a gown designed for celebration reduced to evidence of a nightmare. She noted the position of the body, the angle of blood spatter on the wall, the broken champagne glass beneath the lamp. Every detail mattered, especially when the suspect was not just a groom, but a man of the cloth. Forensic teams moved in carefully. They collected swabs from the mattress, lifted fingerprints from the shattered bottle, and bagged the torn fragments of lace. The coroner confirmed multiple blunt force injuries and stab-like wounds caused by the jagged glass stem. Time of death was estimated around midnight, consistent with the neighbors' reports of hearing shouting and glass breaking. A bloody handprint on the headboard matched the pastor's, cementing his presence in the violent struggle. Back at the station, Hughes sat across from him in the interrogation room. The pastor appeared hollow, his eyes rimmed red, his wedding band still streaked with dried blood. He spoke slowly at first, as if each word was weighed against a lifetime of sermons. He repeated again and again that he felt deceived, that he could not forgive the betrayal. Hughes pressed for clarity. What exactly had she lied about? Why did deception justify murder? At first, he avoided specifics, pacing in circles about betrayal and sin. But gradually, his words painted a clearer picture. On their wedding night, he had discovered that his bride was transgender. He admitted the revelation left him shattered, humiliated, poisoned. He insisted he felt trapped, convinced his life's work and reputation would collapse under the weight of what he saw as deception. "You don't understand," he told Hughes, his voice rising. "I built my entire life on truth. People looked to me for guidance. And she made me a fool. How could I face them? How could I stand before God with that lie in my house?" Hughes knew excuses when she heard them. She noted every word, every pause. Later, prosecutors would use his own statements as evidence that his actions were deliberate, not the result of temporary insanity. Meanwhile, investigators dug into the bride's background. Paperwork showed she had legally changed her name several years earlier. Medical records confirmed her gender transition, and all her documentation was valid. Friends from her past, contacted through old addresses, described her as brave, resilient, and fearful of rejection. One friend broke down on the phone. She finally found love. She thought she was safe with him. She thought he was different. As the news spread, the small Florida town was thrown into chaos. Congregants who had celebrated in the pews hours earlier now found their church splashed across national headlines. Some expressed disbelief, insisting the pastor must have been provoked beyond reason. Others, especially younger members, were horrified. "No secret justifies murder," one churchgoer told a local reporter. If his faith was real, he would have chosen compassion. Social media exploded. Hashtags like hashtag justice for the bride and hashtag betrayed pastor trended simultaneously, each representing starkly different narratives. National commentators debated whether the pastor was a cold-blooded killer or a man undone by a shock too great to bear. LGBTQ+ advocates rallied online, calling the case a hate crime rooted in prejudice. Religious commentators, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the act with the image of a man who had preached forgiveness and truth. Back in the lab, Forensic analysis tightened the noose. DNA beneath the bride's fingernails matched the pastor, proof of defensive struggle. The blood patterns suggested repeated blows rather than a single moment of rage. The champagne bottle fragments bore both their prints, but only his blood, indicating he had wielded it after it shattered. The narrative of heat of passion was weakened by the sheer brutality of the scene. Prosecutors prepared charges of second-degree murder, noting that while the killing may not have been premeditated, it was carried out with undeniable intent. Assistant District Attorney Carling Nguyen summarized it bluntly. Shock does not excuse savagery. Betrayal does not justify death. Hughes, in interviews, admitted the case shook even her seasoned perspective. "We deal with lies and secrets all the time," she told a local paper. But this was about a man who claimed to value truth above all else, yet chose violence when faced with it. That contradiction is what made this case so devastating. In the weeks leading to trial, the community became a battleground of opinion. Vigils were held for the bride, candles flickering outside the courthouse with posters reading she deserved love, not death. At the same time, some supporters of the pastor gathered at the church steps, clutching Bibles, insisting he was a good man who had been pushed past his breaking point. The divide ran through families, friendships, and the congregation itself, leaving scars that would last long after the verdict. For the detectives, though, the case was simple. They had a body, evidence of violence, a confession, and a motive rooted not in mystery, but in fear and pride. The puzzle was complete. What remained was for a jury to decide whether the pastor's fall from grace would end in redemption or in a prison cell. The courthouse in Jacksonville was overflowing on the first day of trial. Reporters camped outside with cameras pointed toward the entrance, eager to capture every step of the disgraced pastor as deputies escorted him in, his hands shackled and his once immaculate appearance replaced by a gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. The case had become a national obsession, a wedding night murder, a pastor-turned-killer, a secret revealed too late. For the prosecution, it was a straightforward matter of brutality. For the defense, it was an uphill battle to convince a jury that shock, betrayal, and emotional collapse could explain away what had happened. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Spectators filled the benches, whispering in hushed tones, while family members of the bride sat clutching tissues and framed photos of her smiling face. Across the aisle, a handful of loyal church members came to support the pastor, their expressions drawn, torn between disbelief and devotion. Assistant District Attorney Carling Nguyen opened with a clear, unwavering voice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, marriage is built on trust. But no matter what secrets are kept, no matter what truths are revealed, violence is never the answer." On his wedding night, this man, who preached about love and forgiveness, chose violence. He beat and killed the woman who trusted him. And today, you will see that his actions were not a momentary lapse. They were deliberate, cruel, and final. Nguyen then laid out the evidence. The bloody handprints, the shattered glass used as a weapon, the defensive wounds on the bride's arms, the pastor's own words captured in his confession. "She lied to me. She lied to God." She emphasized that the case wasn't about theology or personal beliefs. It was about a man who turned his anger into murder. The defense attorney, Samuel Breyer, countered with a different narrative. He portrayed his client as a man overwhelmed by shock, raised in a world where honesty and faith were everything, blindsided by a truth that struck at the core of his identity. "This is not a story of a cold-blooded killer," Breyer told the jury. "This is the story of a man who suffered a psychological break, who was pushed into a moment of uncontrollable despair. He is guilty of losing control, but not of calculated murder." Witness testimony began with the investigators. Detective Carla Hughes described the crime scene with clinical detail. The bed soaked in blood, the glass fragments, the roses trampled underfoot. The jury was shown photographs, carefully filtered but still graphic enough to draw gasps from the gallery. Hughes explained how DNA under the bride's fingernails matched the pastor, how the blood spatter indicated multiple blows. Each piece of forensic evidence painted a picture of rage sustained long enough to silence any claim of a single, impulsive act. The medical examiner followed, testifying that the bride suffered blunt force trauma and deep puncture wounds consistent with being attacked with a broken object. She had fought back, leaving bruises and scratches on the pastor's arms. The ME's conclusion was stark. This was not instantaneous. This was a prolonged assault. The defense tried to soften the image, cross-examining witnesses with questions about timing and state of mind. Could shock impair judgment? Could a man raised under extreme religious pressure react irrationally to a revelation like this? They introduced a psychologist who testified about dissociative rage, explaining how some individuals can snap under extreme emotional stress. He didn't plan this, the psychologist said. He wasn't in control of himself in that moment. But the prosecution struck back hard. A.D. Nguyen reminded the jury that the pastor had stopped, spoken words of accusation, then resumed the attack. That's not dissociation, she argued. That's choice. She projected the pastor's police interview transcript onto a screen, highlighting the line, "I couldn't let that stand." Nguyen let the words hang in the courtroom. Those are not the words of a man lost in confusion. Those are the words of a man who made a decision. The emotional peak of the trial came when a close friend of the bride took the stand. Through tears, she described the bride's journey, her struggles, and her hope for acceptance. She finally believed she had found someone who would love her without judgment, the friend said. She walked into that church with joy in her heart, and by the end of that night, she was gone. The courtroom fell silent, jurors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The pastor himself took the stand in a controversial move. His attorney believed the jury needed to hear his voice, his remorse. He spoke softly, recounting his upbringing, the crushing weight of expectations, the fear that his entire life had been built on a lie. Tears rolled down his face as he described discovering the truth on his wedding night. I felt like everything I believed in collapsed in that moment, he said. I wasn't myself. I was broken, and I can't take back what I did. On cross-examination, Nguyen was relentless. She asked if his bride begged for her life. He admitted she did. She asked if he struck her more than once. He bowed his head and whispered yes. Then she asked the question that sealed the silence in the room. At any moment, Pastor, could you have walked out of that room instead of choosing to kill her? His pause was long, heavy, before he finally murmured yes. Closing arguments brought the case into sharp focus. The defense pleaded for mercy, asking the jury to consider manslaughter rather than murder, insisting that the killing was the tragic result of overwhelming shock. The prosecution urged the jury not to excuse cruelty under the veil of religion or surprise. We all face truths we don't want to hear, Nguyen said. Most of us don't kill because of them. He chose violence, and a woman is dead because of it. That is murder. The jury deliberated for nearly 2 full days. Tension gripped the courthouse as reporters speculated on every delay, every note sent back to the judge. When the verdict finally came, the room erupted into a hush so deep it seemed even the air held its breath. On the charge of second-degree murder, the foreperson read, "We find the defendant guilty." The bride's family wept openly, clutching each other in relief and sorrow. The pastor slumped in his chair, his face pale, whispering a prayer no one could hear. Outside, crowds of protesters and supporters collided in a storm of chants, holding up signs that reflected the nation's divide. For some, justice had been served. For others, a man of faith had been condemned without compassion. But inside the courtroom, the verdict was clear. A wedding night turned into a killing ground, and no defense could erase the choice that had been made. The verdict reverberated far beyond the walls of the Jacksonville courthouse. By the time the jurors were dismissed and the pastor was led back into custody, the story had already been broadcast live on national news. Cable anchors repeated the shocking headline with practiced gravity. Florida pastor convicted of murdering his bride on their wedding night. The case had already fascinated the nation for months, but the conviction gave it a new life, one that would linger in debates, talk shows, and social media long after the courtroom fell silent. In the small Florida town where it all began, the church became a focal point of tension. On Sunday morning, just 2 days after the verdict, the pews were half empty. Some longtime congregants said they couldn't bear to sit beneath the stained glass windows where the pastor once preached about truth and love. Others showed up defiantly, insisting their church should not be defined by one man's actions. Outside, protesters gathered with signs that read "Justice for the Bride" and "Love Shouldn't Kill." Across the street, a smaller group of supporters held Bibles aloft, chanting that the pastor had been betrayed, not criminal. The divide wasn't just visible in the streets. It had cut families and friendships in half. Local media interviewed townspeople, many of whom struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the murderer portrayed in court. One deacon admitted, "I used to tell people our pastor was the most honest man I'd ever met. Now I don't know if I ever really knew him." A younger churchgoer, visibly shaken, told reporters, "This isn't just about him. This is about how some people still can't accept the truth of who others are. She didn't deserve this." On social media, the case became a flashpoint in America's ongoing cultural debates. The hashtag Justice for the Bride trended nationwide, with activists and allies demanding the murder be recognized as part of a broader pattern of violence against transgender women. Memes circulated, comparing the pastor's fiery sermons about forgiveness with the brutality of his crime. LGBTQ+ organizations held vigils in cities from Miami to New York, candles glowing in the night as names of victims of similar violence were read aloud. At the same time, conservative commentators took to television and online platforms to paint the pastor as a man driven to the edge by deceit. They insisted the real tragedy was that he hadn't been told the truth before marriage, framing his crime as the consequence of betrayal rather than hatred. Their arguments sparked outrage, fueling late-night talk show monologues and passionate op-eds. "Being shocked," one columnist wrote, "is not a license to kill." The bride's family became reluctant public figures. Her sister spoke at a press conference outside the courthouse, her voice breaking as she held a framed photo of the bride in her wedding gown. She was kind. She was hopeful. She believed in love, even when the world told her not to. And now she's gone because someone decided her truth wasn't good enough. Don't let her death be in vain. The image of her trembling hands clutching that photo was replayed across every news channel, cementing the bride as both a victim of murder and a symbol of a broader struggle for acceptance. For the pastor's congregation, the fallout was devastating. Attendance plummeted. Donations dried up. The once bustling Sunday school classrooms echoed with emptiness. The church board debated whether to dissolve entirely, while others pushed to rebrand and heal. Rumors spread of members leaving to join other congregations, ashamed to admit they had once followed a man now infamous for violence. Nationally, the story became a cultural mirror. Talk shows invited panels of psychologists, faith leaders, and activists to argue about truth, deception, gender identity, and morality. Some asked whether stricter laws should apply to crimes against transgender individuals. Others wondered aloud how faith communities could reconcile compassion with long-held dogmas. For weeks, the pastor's name remained in headlines, not as a respected spiritual leader, but as shorthand for betrayal, rage, and hypocrisy. Even months later, the scars were visible. The hotel where the murder occurred quietly renovated the honeymoon suite, removing every trace of the crime. But staff admitted whispers lingered, guests occasionally asking if they were staying in that room. Local businesses noticed fewer tourists passing through, wary of a town now associated with tragedy. What endured most was the bride's memory. At vigils, her name was spoken with reverence, her life honored with music, candles, and prayers. Portraits of her smiling face were carried through marches, alongside banners declaring she deserved to live. Though the trial was over, the conversation it ignited showed no signs of fading. In many ways, her death forced a reckoning, a painful confrontation with prejudice, with rigid beliefs, and with the consequences of silence. For the community that once celebrated the union, the wedding would never be remembered as a fairy tale beginning. It would forever be the night faith was tested, trust was broken, and a pastor's dark revelation ended in blood. The sentencing hearing drew nearly as much attention as the trial itself. Weeks had passed since the guilty verdict, but the weight of the crime lingered over Jacksonville like humidity that refused to lift. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were again crowded. Supporters of the bride holding candles and photos, supporters of the pastor clutching Bibles and signs demanding mercy. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, every seat filled as Judge Leonard Harlow prepared to hand down the sentence that would define the rest of the pastor's life. The bride's family was given the first word. Her younger sister stood at the podium, hands trembling as she read a statement through tears. She believed in love. She believed in him. And she believed she was safe. That trust was destroyed, and now all we have left is her memory. No sentence can bring her back, but we pray this court recognizes the value of her life. Their voices broke the silence, filling the courtroom with grief that no legal process could erase. When it was the pastor's turn to speak, he rose slowly, shackles rattling at his ankles. His once commanding voice had been reduced to a low rasp. He apologized, not to the family directly, but to God, to his congregation, to those misled by my weakness. He insisted again that he was overcome by shock, but admitted, I should have walked away. I failed as a man, as a husband, and as a servant of God. Some spectators wept. Others turned away, unmoved by what they heard as a hollow confession. Judge Harlow delivered the sentence with steady gravity. He acknowledged the arguments of both sides, but reminded the courtroom that the evidence showed deliberate violence. This was not one moment of panic. This was repeated, sustained assault against a defenseless woman on the night she should have been safest, he said. With that, he sentenced the pastor to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps rippled through the room, some from relief, others from disbelief. The bride's family clutched each other, sobbing as the judge's words sank in. The pastor lowered his head, lips moving in a silent prayer, before deputies led him out. For many, the image of him disappearing through the side door in chains symbolized the final collapse of a man once held up as a beacon of righteousness. In the aftermath, the consequences spread far beyond the prison walls. The church board voted to close the congregation permanently, unable to recover from the scandal. The once bustling sanctuary was boarded up, its stained glass windows left to gather dust, a haunting reminder of how quickly faith can curdle into tragedy. For the bride's family, closure was elusive. They held a memorial service in her honor, this time not in a church but in a community center, surrounded by advocates and friends who celebrated her life as more than the circumstances of her death. Photos of her smiling, singing, and volunteering were displayed on easels. Candles lined the stage. Her name was added to lists read at vigils across the country, remembered among those lost to violence for being who they were. The wider community wrestled with its conscience. Some who had once idolized the pastor admitted to questioning their own biases in silence. Others doubled down, insisting the tragedy proved the dangers of secrets. But most were left with an unease that couldn't be shaken. If someone so publicly righteous could commit such violence, what did that say about the fragility of trust and the dangers of prejudice? In prison, the pastor's life shrank to a cell and a number. Guards reported he spent long hours reading scripture, writing in notebooks, and avoiding contact with other inmates. For a man who once commanded crowds, his new existence was one of isolation and anonymity. The bride's name, however, lived on. Advocates carried her story into classrooms, rallies, and documentaries, reminding the world that she was more than a victim. She was a woman who wanted love, who believed she'd found it, and who paid the price for another person's fear. The sentencing closed a chapter, but the story itself refused to fade. It remained as both a warning and a memorial. A wedding night turned into a tragedy, a community forced to confront its deepest prejudices, and two families bound forever by a single act of violence. Months after the sentencing, the Florida town where it all began remained uneasy, as though a shadow, still hung over its streets. The church, once a beacon of worship and fellowship, stood shuttered with weeds growing through cracks in the steps. Locals passed it quietly, avoiding eye contact with the building that had once been filled with hymns but was now remembered for betrayal and blood. To many, it was no longer a house of God, but a monument to what happens when fear and pride drown out compassion. The bride's memory, however, continued to ripple outward. Her face appeared at vigils across the country, her name spoken alongside others who had been silenced by violence. Activists carried candles bearing her initials, demanding that her death not be dismissed as just another tragedy, but recognized as part of a larger story about acceptance and safety. In Miami, murals were painted showing her in her wedding dress, smiling against a backdrop of roses that had not yet been stained by violence. To her family, these gestures were small comforts, proof that while her life had been cut short, her story had not been erased. For the pastor, life narrowed to prison walls and the echo of his own conscience. Some said he spent his days buried in scripture. Others claimed he barely spoke at all. Whether in prayer or in silence, his existence became a stark contrast to the pulpit he once commanded. From the outside, people debated whether he was remorseful or merely regretful about being caught. Inside, the truth of his soul belonged only to him and the God he once claimed to serve. In living rooms, churches, and classrooms, the case sparked conversations that had been avoided for too long. Parents found themselves answering difficult questions from their children about truth, identity, and acceptance. Pastors and other congregations addressed the subject head-on, urging compassion where once there had been silence. Social media continued to argue, but amid the noise, one simple truth stood out. No secret, no shock, no sense of betrayal could justify taking a life. What remained was the uneasy realization that tragedy could grow not just from lies, but from rigid expectations, from faith wielded without mercy, and from a refusal to face uncomfortable truths with empathy. The wedding night that was supposed to mark a beginning had instead become an ending that forced an entire community, and perhaps an entire nation, to look in the mirror. And so the story lingers, not as a tale of romance gone wrong, but as a cautionary parable. It reminds us that love without honesty is fragile, that faith without compassion can curdle into cruelty, and that lives built on silence are always in danger of shattering. The bride deserved a future. The pastor chose to take it, and in that choice, he lost his own. The candles lit at her vigils may eventually burn out, but the lesson of that Florida night endures. The cost of fear, the weight of prejudice, and the devastation left when betrayal is met not with truth, but with blood.